Center. Welcome to the Talk Center. We're very happy to have with us today David Hooker, who is Associate Professor of the Practice of Peace and Transformation at the Talk Center at Sudan. And we had a fascinating conversation this morning actually about extreme work that he's been doing both in South Sudan and in South Carolina. So I think his experience across peaceful and transformation across a variety of units is really fascinating, and hopefully something that we can learn from here at the Mershon Center as we build up our own peace and conflict program. So please join me in welcoming David Hooker.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the invitation. Aaron, Terry, everybody who helped to organize it. I appreciate you all doing that. This is actually bucket list work for me. When I was very young, this is where I wanted to go to college. I wanted to go to the Ohio State University. I didn't want to go to Ohio State. I wanted to go to the Ohio State University, right? And my father said, you can go anywhere you want. And when you get there, call Morehouse because I'm sending your tuition check to Morehouse. So you feel free to go wherever you want to go to college. And so I'm actually, in many ways, I am a Morehouse man and I'm still a Buckeye at heart. What I actually want to do, no PowerPoint, no anything like that, what I actually want to do for a few minutes this afternoon is just kind of reflect a little bit. I want to talk about kind of how I think about process engaging between scholarship and practice in a fairly particular way. And then we can talk. I'm certainly willing to answer questions and engage and lean into some of the projects that I'm specifically involved in right now. We're doing politicized healing with the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Some of you probably not familiar with the Chicago Torture Justice Center, but I'm all in to talk about the Chicago Torture Justice Center, some of the leadership development and trauma healing work that we've been doing for the last 12 years in South Sudan. The Greensboro Counter Stories Project is particularly fascinating, and I am serving right now as the convener for the Police Community Roundtable in South Bend, Indiana, which recently took on more significance. Right? When I was originally called to convene, it was just a small town mayor of a town of a couple of, less than a couple 100,000 people, and now it's under the national eye, and so it's a very different project that we're involved in. But so I'm glad to talk about any of those, particularly in relationship to the reflections that I want to offer. Right? So let's begin. The principles of liberal democracy that were foundational for the establishment of some of the great European societies of the United States are at the very least under assault, and in many quarters, it seems that these principles might have been or are being completely rejected. When we consider the rising interest in and the tumult occasioned by the ascendancy of nationalist, ethnocentrist, racist, and in many significant ways anti-democratic parties throughout the West and now the global South, especially what's happening in South America, we have to every day pay more attention to the significance of the authoritarian regimes like Russia and China and some of the others. And we realize that these deep societal divisions are creating a ground where we probably could use a new consensus on values. The principles and the institutions that form liberal democracy clearly under siege, and they raise the question for those of us who are working in civil society and working at the grassroots, who are legitimately the people to be regarded and engaged in trying to craft a way forward? How much room should we leave for those who are invested in the old ways, who are wed to historical patterns of domination and isolation? Who, in fact, are the people? In Germany, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this huge celebration. This vast majority of people were crying out, "We are one people." I can't say it in German. I studied German a little bit when I was young, but I don't want to pretend with that anymore. We are one people. Later, in response to kind of some nationalist and anti-immigrant rhetoric, which is really always mingled kind of with the historically revisionist, anti-Semitic, fascist flirtation, the anti-immigrant group sought to claim that they spoke for a silent majority. And so they were saying, we're the people. And there was pushback. No, we are the people, right? There was this emphasis. But as that immigration pattern kept going, it seems as though there's a large, probably even a majority of the population that has adopted this exclusionist belief, and the claim has shifted. And so the anti-immigrant rhetoric has gone from "we are the people" to "we are the people." The question is, who gets to claim this narrative of the people? Who gets to decide? Who gets to be involved in determining the way forward? The same thing is happening. So in France, right after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the idea was this notion of laïcité, which used to be like France's strong commitment to a secular inclusion as a way of defining French culture, actually became weaponized in ways that were able to exclude people. And so laïcité went from an inclusion to a methodology for exclusion. Those who don't believe in, their values don't represent laïcité are not French. And so there's this question of who is allowed to be part of the dialogue, who gets to claim we are the people. The UK, we think we're watching Brexit. We're not certain that Brexit is happening, but if it is happening, at least the debate is happening. And so in the UK, Stuart Hall reminds us that belonging, he says, is a really tricky concept. I'm quoting him. It requires both identifications and recognitions. In considerations of what it means to be British, for example, he highlights the ways in which familiar ideas about national belonging are actually embedded with power, discrimination, domination. Quoting, "If people from ethnic minorities are to become not only citizens with equal rights, but also an integral part of the national culture, then the meaning of the term British will have to become more inclusive, their experiences, values, more inclusive of their experiences, values, and aspirations. In other words, in order to be both a multi-ethnic and monocultural is a contradiction." So the question posed when you're trying to engage and determine how to find a way forward is, who are these the people? And the reason this is really important is because populist representatives and popular representatives always both say that they are speaking for, on behalf of, or in representation of the people. So the question is, who are these the people? And there are so many places we can look to see that people are being excluded by virtue of some aspect of their character. In Myanmar, it's the Rohingya. In China, it's the Uyghur. In Venezuela, Brazil, Zimbabwe, and so many other places. The question now is both who's allowed to be in, who is given the comfort of state institutions, and for whom will state-sanctioned violence be leveled against them as a mechanism for control and marginalization. We recently started a research project in Rwanda to determine what has been the effect of 25 years. Last week was a celebration of the 25th year since the genocide in Rwanda. And the question is, how has social cohesion been structured in Rwanda? The mechanism that they use, there's a kind of a forced cohesion or a forced reconciliation that has been used, which is to say, those who are given the cover and the benefits of being Rwandese have to say, we are Rwandese, meaning they have to reject their historical narratives, whatever the salience may have been for those historical ethnic narratives. They have to be willing to reject those in order to be considered part of the people. And in the United States, we've got the same thing. We've got all kinds of contestations that are happening here. And in many ways, the United States reminds me of South Sudan in the fact that there are people born in this country who understand themselves to be native daughters and sons of the country, who are still struggling to be able to experience full operationalized citizenship because of race, class, gender, ethnicity, affectional tendencies, religious affiliations. All those categories are being assessed to determine whether someone will experience fully operationalized citizenship, or whether they'll be subject to state-sanctioned violence, or whether the state will just turn a blind eye to privately sponsored violence and acts of discrimination. And it's not like these things are going away. And so when I get invited into these contexts, I only go by invitation, when I get invited into these contexts to do work, when you're working in Tier 2 and Tier 3 in civil society, grassroots, and you're trying to engage people to figure out a way forward, the question is, who are the people, right? Who are the people? One of my primary sets of practices and skill sets is around dialogue, civil discourse, engagement, some restorative practices, conferencing, circling, whatever those kinds of healing practices are. And yet, in the last several years, as I have become, because I primarily, let me say a word about myself just for a second. For 30 years, I have primarily considered myself to be a hunter and gatherer, right? Like, I do work. I didn't have a institutional affiliation. You go out, you find the work, you do the work, you just, you hunt, you do the work that's available to you, which allowed me to be a practitioner, to develop a set of skills, practices, a theory of change for community, particularly for communities coming out of violent context. I had this set of skills. And then in the last several years, 5 or so, I've kind of transitioned to being a scholar practitioner. This is what they say. This is what they tell me. You are now a scholar practitioner, right? And so I wanted to do this thing where I go and I ask my colleagues, what are the theories, what are the frameworks that will help us to understand how to engage people when we're in community? Like, what can you tell me? Like, I have a skill set. I have practices that I normally know what to do. What is the theory? What are some theories that will allow us to better do our work? And one of the theory sets that I have been offered, that I was told I should sincerely consider, is Chantal Mouffe's notion of agonism, right? Do you know this idea that people who follow Mouffe, they strongly encourage me to rethink practices of dialogue and restorative justice that are often employed in post-violence contexts, because what they wanted me to do was understand Mouffe's argument, which is that consensus, which is the thing that we often try to do, is actually the production of hegemony. Like, you can't have, if you're building consensus, you are supporting the production of hegemony, and in some ways you are reinstilling some power structure and hierarchical structure in those communities, and so you have to avoid building consensus. And so all the work that I've done, Chantal Mouffe would say, you're off track, you're off base, you're not supposed to be doing this work, which is really interesting for me. So what she says, or what is said in her name, is that consensus-oriented politics have fallen out of favor, primarily because the search for reasoned agreement comes with the risk of suppressing open expression of dissent and cultural plurality. Norm-guided dialogue aspiring towards consensus shuts down, not simply nurtures, but shuts down spaces for unconstrained expressions of alternative identities and viewpoints. According to Mouffe, consensus is always impossible, and efforts towards the attainment are coercive because exclusion serves as the very possibility of consensus. So in communities are always doing two things. They're including and they're excluding, and what consensus serves to do is give legitimacy to the exclusion. So consensus is a pursuit that aims to give particular ideas, particular symbols, specific values, and guiding principles a transcendent place in popular conscience, and the attainment of such discursive transition has the effect of curtailing the agency of those that wouldn't otherwise accept. So consensus is hegemony. You are reproducing hegemony. So I think so in places like South Sudan, is consensus not something that we should strive for? South Sudan, the people of South Sudan, nobody in leadership in South Sudan was born South Sudanese. The country's only been around for 11 years. Everybody who was born, who is now South Sudanese, was born Sudanese. The country has been through 400 years of oppression, 150 years of colonialism. They've just emerged from 50 years of civil war, and right after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was inked, they went back into violent cycles of victimhood and violence and retribution that were dividing the country along ethnic, religious, and tribal lines. And so the question is, should we not be seeking some form of consensus or values that they can build on, that they can have an identity from? There's no current South Sudanese national identity to have pride in, because they've never been South Sudanese. They've only been able to have pride in their ethnic groups. And so if we allow this agonism that Chantal Mouffe encourages to go full forward, does it doom a place like South Sudan to continuing retribution, cycles of victimhood and violence? Or is the consensus that supposedly produces hegemony an acceptable path or pattern in those moments? Should we do hegemony or full agency in a place that we know will allow for this ongoing, these contestations which often become violent? So, as Mouffe sees it, liberal democracies that keep open spaces for confrontation are best living up to the emancipatory promise, because in such arrangement, power relations are always being put into question, and no victory can be final. No victory can be final. So in a place where power arrangements are always contested, must you already have a stabilized democracy and then allow this emancipatory effect? Or will it naturally emerge just in the cycles, the ongoing cycles of victimhood and violence? I don't know. This is the question. So I'm wondering whether that theory helps. I'd love to hear your thinking on whether this theory helps us as we're trying to figure out what it is that we do when we go into these spaces. The problem is it's not just in like those emerging democracies. We've got this ongoing contest that's happening here in the United States that cycles through periods of victimhood and violence. Are any of you watching the PBS Henry Louis Gates work on Reconstruction as a reminder of it's a brilliant work to remind us kind of right after the Civil War, there was a next war during the emerging efforts at black liberation and, black agency. There was another set of violent recriminations, and it looks very much like something that has been happening since 2008 in this country, where there's this upsurge in violence seemingly to repress efforts at liberation or even equality. And so my sense is that in order to determine a way forward in these places where there's this contestation, it may not actually be a political question. Politics may play a part, governance may play a significant part, but I think that a better framing for understanding how we go forward is understanding the effects of historical trauma. And so I want to do a really, really quick little talk about why I think this historical trauma is important and why narrative responses to historical trauma are maybe the way forward instead of these other consensus models in civil discourse. Historical trauma refers to this complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who either pre-trauma or as a result of trauma share an identity, affiliation, or are forced into the same circumstances. Historical trauma was originally crafted. It was an idea that was originally constructed to talk about the children of Holocaust survivors, but it can certainly be applied to African American, to Indigenous American, to Japanese American survivors of internment camps, to Palestinian youth, to people of Cyprus, to Cambodians, to Mexicans. So there are so many people, so many groups that have experienced this historical trauma. What's important, though, to remember is that trauma is not an event. Trauma is not the experience or the condition. Trauma, people perform trauma when they've experienced conditions, circumstances in which they were overwhelmed. When the circumstances are traumagenic, people are overwhelmed, they perform trauma. But trauma isn't the event itself. Trauma is representation of the event. Why does that matter? That it's representation and not the event. Why does it matter that it's representation and not the circumstances? Because if it's representation, then it's not necessarily based on material facts upon which we would all agree. It's a narrative. What allows trauma to continue from generation to generation is the representation of it, because the traumagenic circumstances have gone away. The Holocaust is past, and yet there are indications of that trauma that have been passed down from generation to generation in the narratives, in the narratives of identity that people have. African Americans, Cyprus, Turkish, Armenians, indigenous folks all have these narratives. Now, it's not to suggest that because it's embedded in narrative that it's not real. It's still real. It's just the historic trauma produces an identity. The identities are what we perform, and usually over time, our identity is best performed as being against an other. The most loyal South Sudanese are people who are against the Arab, who hate the Arab. In so many other places, the way that you demonstrate your identity effectively is not by anything that you do internally in the community, but it's as over and against an other. And so trauma emerges as a set of narratives that get passed down, and it shapes identities. And then those identities get built into our systems and structures in ways that when those identities are asked or invited to shift, it triggers trauma, it re-triggers trauma. This is, David Rock is a neuroscientist. David Rock is a neuroscientist. And he has this acronym, SCARF, S-C-A-R-F, SCARF. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And what he's discovered is that when any of those are threatened, particularly status, autonomy, relatedness are threatened in certain ways, it triggers the same neural pathways as if you had a gun held to your head, or you were in the midst of crossfire in a gunfight or in a war zone. And so when your status is threatened by equality, if your identity was formed based on a particular hierarchy, and then equality would threaten that status, then these contestations become life. They're like for survival. People are trying to survive. It's what Judith Butler would describe precarity. The idea, precarity, quoting Judith Butler, designates this politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, death. Such populations are at heightened risk of disease, poverty, starvation. Precarity is the idea that anything living can be expunged at will or by accident, and its persistence is in no sense guaranteed. And so what we're dealing with, what we're seeing in these contestations, is a sense of precarity, which means that the people aren't the problem. It's not that we're working with xenophobes and racists and, advocates and these anti-police folks or whatever. It's not, the people aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. And so how do you create spaces that respond to the sense of precarity without allowing that agonism and that ongoing contestation that says, is there a way to find a way forward that doesn't require the continuing kind of violent contestation, but allows for the recognition of the real sense of threat of extinction? Yes, there is. And it comes out of narrative practice. John Winslade has a text called When Stories Clash. And in this text, he gives us 3 principles for how to deal with these things. He's only talking about kind of family clashes and things like that, but I've elevated it to think that it works at the social level as well. So you honor the story as given for what is given. You don't worry about it in terms of it's not a recitation of facts. It's a way that people make meaning of the world. You externalize the problem. People aren't the problem is the problem. How do we deal with the problem? If the problem is precarity, if the problem is fear, how do you react to fear? How do I react to fear? And you create, and this is the most important thing, you create and construct a narrative for a preferred future. Like if status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, our sense of threat are all projections of a future. And so how do we construct a narrative of a preferred future? So we go back to Chantel Mouffe, who says that creating a shared narrative of a preferred future is hegemony. If we are forced to agree today on what the future will look like and what the trajectory that we'll go to get there, then that produces hegemony. That produces the kind of domination practices based on a current power structure. And so we don't want to build a shared narrative of a future. We want to build what Lee Ross and Byron Bland would say is a narrative of a shared future. Do you hear the difference? Not a shared narrative of a future, but a narrative of a shared future. We agree that there's a place for everybody to exist in the future, and our only places of contestation is when your path and my path actually impede one another. Otherwise, and so we should have some contestation, but that contestation exists in what Jacques Rancière would call dissensus, which is that our disagreement is what keeps us together and it structures our way forward. And so as opposed to being agonism that drives us apart, it's a dissensus, a way of knowing that we have to disagree, that we have to be in disagreement, but it's in that creative disagreement and dissensus that we weave a way forward. And so I believe that it is in the honoring of that dissensus that we can find our way forward in some of these contests that we're in. If we construct a narrative of a shared future, it doesn't require hegemony and it doesn't require consensus. It's spaces that don't require domination. They allow for power differentials. It's contestation without the inevitable cycles of victimhood and violence, and identities that were originally formed in trauma as being over and against one another become identities originally formed in trauma that actually need one another going forward. A preferred narrative of a shared future is what I actually imagine the founders were saying when they said, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for a common defense and promote general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. I believe that if we honor dissensus in these moments of contestation, we can actually construct a reconfigured we the people that will allow us to go forward effectively. Yes.